Hello everyone, have a nice day. Today we'll explore a tense turning point between Diep and James's father, where money is used like a weapon and pride becomes a shield. Diep walks into the wood workshop with a bold decision, proving she won't be controlled or bought. And just when the pressure feels unbearable, James appears not to rescue her, but to stand beside her as she chooses her own strength. If you find this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. The first sound wasn't the saw. It was the soft tap of rubber bands against wood. Polite, almost delicate, like someone setting down flowers at a grave. Diep stood at the long table in the middle of the workshop yard, and the morning light turned every floating fleck of sawdust into gold. In front of her, thick bundles of cash, 200 million zhong stacked neatly, pressed flat, placed down one by one with hands that didn't tremble. Across from her, Mr. Hoan finally lifted his eyes. For 6 months, that money had been a shadow hanging over her life, something that didn't just sit in a bag, but sat in her chest. Back then, he had slid it toward her like a final judgment. Take it, leave James, disappear. As if her love could be reduced to a number, like lumber measured and priced. Diep had been poor, exhausted, terrified for Ly, and even more terrified of being crushed by a world that spoke money like a native language. But the woman standing here now didn't look like someone who had been bought. She looked like someone who had rebuilt herself. Mr. Hoan's voice came flat, as if he refused to show curiosity. You came back. Diep zipped the plain black bag open, revealing the emptiness as if she were proving something without begging for applause. I did. Workers nearby slowed, pretending to stay busy. The machines kept whirring, but the air tightened. Even the hammer strikes inside the yard sounded like a countdown. Mr. Hoan's gaze flicked over her steady hands, square shoulders, and calm face. He looked for cracks the way men like him always did. What do you want? He asked, like he already knew and still wanted her to say it first. Diep slid the last bundle forward. Your money, all of it. His jaw tightened. You kept it for 6 months. I kept it untouched. Diep didn't raise her voice, but it carried anyway. Not one note spent. It was never mine, and it was never your right to use it to decide my life. A worker coughed behind them. Someone shifted a plank. No one laughed. Mr. Hoan leaned closer, as if a lie might be hiding in her pupils. So this is a performance, he murmured. You want to look brave in front of my people? Diep didn't blink. I came to close a door you tried to lock from the outside. For a second, that landed hard enough to silence even his sneer. He straightened, scoffing. You think returning this makes you strong? Diep reached into her bag again and pulled out a small notebook. Its corners were worn. The pages were filled with numbers written in tight, careful lines. Profit, costs, dates, reminders. Not pretty, not polished, real. She set it beside the money like evidence. I started with nothing, she said. A borrowed cart, late nights, burned hands, empty mornings. I learned how to sell, how to count, how to stand up when I wanted to hide. Her voice didn't shake. I pay my own bills now. I take care of Ly. Everything here, she tapped the notebook once, was built from the ground. Mr. Huan looked at the notebook like it offended him, like proof of struggle was a language he refused to respect. Then his eyes lifted again, sharp. "And you think that makes you worthy of James?" Diep inhaled slowly, controlled, and when she spoke, it wasn't pleading. It was a declaration. "No, I think love makes me worthy of love, and I love James without conditions." She stepped closer, not in aggression, but in clarity. "I'm not asking for permission to stand beside him." Something shifted in Mr. Huan's expression. Annoyance, yes, but underneath it a hesitation he tried to bury immediately. He tapped the top bundle with one finger like it was dust. "200 million is nothing in my world," he said, cool and calculated. "If you want me to reconsider, bring 500 million next time." A few workers exchanged glances. The challenge wasn't really about money. It was about control, about forcing her to play his game, about proving she would crawl if he raised the price high enough. Diep stared at him for one heartbeat, then another, and then she nodded once. "Fine," she said. "Mr. Huan's brows lifted slightly, surprise, maybe even satisfaction, until Diep continued, her eyes sharpening like a blade. "Not to buy your approval, not to bargain for James, but because I'm done being the girl you thought you could break." She held his gaze until he couldn't pretend it didn't sting. "I'll do it for myself, for James, for Ly." For the first time, Mr. Huan's posture wavered, just a fraction, like a man who expected tears and found steel. His mouth opened ready with a cruel reply, then closed again when none of his usual weapons landed. Diep zipped the empty bag shut. She turned away without trembling, without apologizing, without looking back for permission to leave. As she walked out, the workshop sounds rushed in again. Saws, hammers, engines trying to pretend nothing had changed. But something had. Behind her, Mr. Huan watched the doorway where she disappeared, his fingers pressed into the wood table as if grounding himself. And in the space she created, quiet, clean, unafraid, a memory rose in him like smoke. A young woman long ago. The same stubborn pride, the same unbreakable eyes, the same refusal to bow. He didn't look at the money anymore. He looked at the emptiness she left behind and wondered, against his own will, whether he had misjudged Diep from the very beginning. Diep didn't rush down the gravel road after leaving the workshop. She walked the way she had entered, measured, deliberate, as if every step belonged to her alone. The sun had climbed higher, warming the dirt and pulling a bright green shine from the rice field edges. Behind her, the saws and hammers faded into distance, but the tension of that table still clung to her skin like dust. 500 million. Mr. Huan had said it was like a leash disguised as a bargain, like a test he expected her to fail so he could call it destiny. Diep exhaled slowly, not defeated, focused. Then she heard an engine hum, low and careful, too familiar to be random. She didn't even turn right away. She simply stopped beneath the thin shade of bamboo, letting the silence stretch until it became a mirror. "You can come out now," she said calmly. A figure shifted near the bend in the road. James stepped forward from behind a cluster of bamboo, posture half guarded, half guilty. He wore a plain dark jacket, nothing flashy, but his eyes were sharp in the way they always became when he was counting exits, watching shadows, measuring risk. Diep's mouth curved into the smallest smile. Not surprised, not offended. "I knew you were there," she said. James rubbed the back of his neck like he'd been caught doing something foolish. "I wasn't trying to spy." "I know." Her gaze softened, but it didn't shrink. "You were protecting me." James' eyes lowered for a second, then lifted again, soft and fierce at the same time. "I couldn't let you face him alone." Diep stepped closer until the space between them felt honest. "I didn't face him alone," she said quietly. "I faced him by myself." That line hit James harder than any argument. His throat worked as if words were stuck there. Then he let out a breath, one he'd been holding since the moment she walked into the workshop yard. "I'm proud of you," he said. No CEO tone, no polish, just James. Diep held his gaze. "Don't look at me like I'm made of glass anymore." "I don't." He hesitated, then admitted the truth he rarely let out. "I look at you like you're the only thing I can't afford to lose." Diep didn't answer with dramatic vows. She reached for his hand instead, steady, sure, and squeezed once, as if to say, "I'm here, I'm not running." They walked home together, close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. Along the path, Diep pointed at small details, the neighbor fixing a stall, a dog asleep in the shade, and James followed her gaze, learning how peace looked in her world. Not in boardrooms, not in headlines, in ordinary things that stayed alive even under pressure. The bamboo house appeared at the end of the path, humble and familiar. The front steps creaked under their weight. Inside, sunlight lay across a wooden table, a kettle, and 2 cups. The air smelled like dried grass and warm tea, simple, steady, real. Diep poured without shaking. James sat down like he belonged there, not like a rich man visiting poverty, but like a man returning to the only place that didn't demand he perform. "He challenged you," James said quietly. Diep nodded. 500 million. James's jaw tightened. "He's trying to control you, control us." "He wants money to be the language of respect," Diep replied, calm-eyed. "But I'm not chasing 500 million to buy his approval." She tapped her worn notebook lightly. "I'll take his challenge as a milestone, for my business, for my life." James leaned forward. "Tell me what you need." Diep's voice softened, but her meaning didn't. "Not rescue," she said, "partnership." James's expression shifted, something unclenching in his chest. Then he nodded once, firm. "Done." Outside, the wind moved through the bamboo walls, whispering like a promise. James laced his fingers with hers across the table, his grip warm and steady. "Maybe. This is the beginning," he said, almost like he was afraid to say it too loudly. Diep looked at him calm, bright, unafraid. "Not peace given to us," she murmured, "peace built by us." And far away in the workshop that still smelled of timber and old power, Mr. Huan sat with a memory he couldn't shake of a young woman long ago, with the same unbreakable eyes. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar press against his certainty. Not surrender, doubt. And in that doubt, a small crack appeared just wide enough for the possibility of change.